We're very excited to be hosting this conversation today, and I'm going to introduce the speakers for the roundtable in a second. But I wanted to say something before we start about the Anti-Colonial Archives Working Group, which is a small group of archival practitioners and researchers from a range of different institutions, which began life in the aftermath of the Cultural Heritage Data School that we held earlier in this year. So that was in March 2022. And we held a public event at that, which looked at questions around archival justice, and anti-colonial archives was the theme of the event, and decided to invite some of the participants in the data school. Agreed to set up a small working group that would start to provide a network really for people in different institutions who are interested in exploring these themes. And it's been a kind of self-directed group. Some of the participants are speaking in this roundtable, and there are others who are not speaking in the roundtable but have contributed to the discussions. And we held a small event, like a workshop in September, which was on a similar theme. I'm going to share in the chat the description of the group so that people can see. And after this event, we will email people who registered with details of both what the group's about and if people are interested in joining a mailing list for future events. One of the principles of the data schools is that they are co-organized or collaboratively designed with the participants. And so this is why we're feeding back into the curriculum of the data schools with this public event. And we will also hopefully be contributing to we'll be organising a workshop, similar in-person one, at the in-person Cultural Heritage Data School in March. So I'd like to introduce, we have three colleagues who are going to join me for a conversation, which is part of the recorded part of this session, and then we'll open up to discussion from the floor. So we have Stephen Rigdon, who is the digital curator at the National Library of Scotland, Dorothy Saboa, who is a teacher, educator and researcher from Makerere University in Uganda, and Marta Musso, who is from Archives Portal Europe, where she's a research manager. We've come up with a set of questions really and discussions that we wanted to share with you around the questions, the issues related to inclusive terminology and colonial archives specifically, but also opening up to broader conversations about offensive and discriminatory language in archives in general, particularly associated with questions related to racism and the heritage of colonialism. So I'd like to start actually by highlighting a project that the National Library of Scotland has been involved with, which is a project looking at developing an inclusive terminology glossary, and I'll share the details of that in the chat in a minute. But I was wondering if, Stephen, we could start with you. How and why did the National Library of Scotland come to initiate this project, reflecting on and challenging the institution's existing use of terminology in its collections? And, were there particular resources and tools that the National Library of Scotland supported in order to implement changes in language and practice?
Thanks, Anne. Yeah. So fundamentally, it started really with our retro-conversion program, which sort of formed a natural review process, and we've been running that since 2011. But it wasn't really until about 2017 when we started working on the fuller descriptions. We started to get into some terminology that we were looking at more closely and wondering, we need to have a look at that and change it. At that time, we didn't really have the resources to be able to go into in-depth analysis. So we were just trying to adapt as we saw things, then try to work with it at that stage. It wasn't really until 2020 when, during lockdown, the library offered internships, and we were able to put forward a proposal based on our earlier realizations and say, look, can we get an internship to look at EDI in the context of description in archives, but also more broadly as well. That was agreed. We got the funding, and we were able to appoint Carissa Chu, who some people will know from all the good work that she's been doing. And Carissa was then given an opportunity, which originally is 6 months, but it was extended slightly, which allowed her to look at our practices, not just in archives and manuscripts, but we also extended it out to look at descriptive practices in printed book areas as well, also moving image, sound, and just to get an overview of what we were doing within the library. That was also tied in with sort of trying to do work in relation to policy development and generally just trying to get a good understanding of where we were in the context of EDI and description within the library.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Stephen. Perhaps you could just we could just move on to talk a little bit about questions of how classifications and labels come to be so problematic. They don't appear in a vacuum, but are obviously constructed for particular purposes. In the case of glam collections from the colonial period, obviously the collection contents are likely to have been either explicitly created by colonizing institutions and may well have played a direct role in justifying colonialism. So I was wondering if I could turn to you, Dorothy, here for a few minutes. And perhaps you could tell us from your perspective as an education researcher and teacher educator who's engaged in particularly training history teachers in Uganda, what issues related to the terminology of colonial era collections are the ones that are most important for you and your colleagues and students?
Thank you very much, Anne. First of all, colonialism in East Africa is one of the topics that we offer at O level for all our history students. So you find that many a times that we show them a number of resources and then collections. And then in the collection, sometimes there is misidentification of the people and the places. There are challenges of absence and prejudice and racism in the selection of the words. For example, I'll just give an example of one of the projects that we held last year of the Magic Lantern, whereby there was a labeling such like missionary with open air class. So one would wonder why there was a description of the missionary and then the open air class was not described at all. So that points to a kind of misidentification and absence. And there are very many other examples where you find that there is a lot of applying of descriptive words to some people, but not to others, which becomes a bit of challenges and also many at times breeds into bias and kinds of inequalities. So I think what we are looking at is really timely in as far as inclusive terminology. It's really timely at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorothy. So to just go back to Stephen, does delving into the detail of archival practice actually help here? For example, if we insist that every time you make an iteration of labeling or categorization and documentation, that's in itself an interpretive act, and that it takes place in a particular historical and social context, so that when we document those changes and differentiate, for example, between presentation labels, which are specifically designed to guide the viewer or reader today, and should take account of the contemporary context and the original labeling, in other words, abandoning what some people have called the ethnographic present of the archive for something that presenting the archive itself as a properly historical and historicized institution. Is that something that can actually help to differentiate between without hiding what has been language that has been used in the past and continuing to make it searchable and accessible for critique and accountability? Is that something that perhaps you've used within the context of your own practice at NLS?
We're certainly aware that catalogue descriptions are created within a particular time frame and they are of their time. One of the areas we were looking at with Carissa was the realization that in making changes to catalogues, you are actually losing some of that context from a particular time that it was actually created. And so When you've got things like published catalogues, you've got a physical record, it stays the same, but with the new digital versions of that, when you're making changes to the catalogue descriptions, you can actually lose that context from the original descriptions. So we are trying to look at a way of actually managing those changes so that there is a way of referring back. Part of that might be to use our, basically we have a digital asset system where we can actually record the catalogue, capture a copy of it, and then make that available to researchers in the future. So that's one way of dealing with those sort of changes that we make. The bigger concern, though, is in terms of actually managing change and actually realizing what changes need to be made, getting consensus around the change, and then recording those decisions so that show the continuity of that decision-making process. The glossary and building confidence about the terms that we would use, and also the descriptive practice about levels of description as well. So there's a lot of things going on there that need to be looked at.
Thanks very much. So just turning back to you, Dorothy, you've talked a little bit, and maybe you could say a little bit more about the project that we did together in terms of developing a workshop using the Magic Lanterns, digitized Magic Lantern slides from Cambridge University collections with your students as an example of this. But like when you're using material from colonial era collections in teaching, what steps do you take to correct, repair, or recontextualize material? I mean, for example, is one approach perhaps rewriting labels for photographs or text? Is that something that perhaps your students might be encouraged to do? Or, for example, take care to present material alongside other sources with contrasting perspectives. So, for example, material from the archives of colonial administrations are presented alongside material created by movements resisting colonialism. And I'd be interested to know if that's something that is reflected within the history teaching curriculum in Uganda in the post-colonial era.
Yes, thank you. We do reflect that in Uganda in teaching, because we really want students to participate in the meaning-making process. So you find that we first of all, like you did mention rightly in the workshop, we first of all introduce the students with the images without labels so that they themselves attach meanings to the labels or to the images. And many times you find that whatever they talk about is quite different. They bring in a kind of context is concerned. So this really becomes very important, because when they identify the actual historical content and they make interpretations, then it makes a lot more sense for the learner. And then, then they can really think about this kind of futuristic processes in the teaching and learning process. Secondly, if we just get an example of what happened in our workshop that you did mention, you'll find that some of the captions were really misleading, or there was a lot of misidentification. And I must say maybe racism, because at 1 minute there were captions talking about tribesman, and then with a young European boy. So in that sense, there was a description of the European boy, but then the tribesman was left without any kind of attaching meaning. And also the other example was with the tribes women who are nude. And you find that it's really barbaric for us in our culture to take photographs of people who are nude. But of course, because of the colonialists had their own interests, so you find that they were able to share some pictures. But students normally present or share pictures to them that they think with people who are well dressed, to show actually that Africans had a culture other than the colonialists who actually were really thinking about colonialism at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thanks. And that's actually a good example of how the issues related to, say, images, photography from colonial era collections are not simply reducible to the words. They may be to do with the actual construction of the image, the setup, and the intentions, the purposes for which the image was taken. But I want to bring in Marta now, and we will go back to the question of words, and we could talk here a little bit about a different method of engaging with archival descriptions using automated methods. So Archives Portal Europe have been working on developing a topic detection tool, which you hope will deal with a difficult problem, how to search for terms which may be necessarily suppressed in public-facing archival descriptions in order to avoid relying on offensive, inaccurate, and outdated language. Or at any rate, that might be a possible usage of this tool, which allows you to search across languages at a kind of entity level, a concept level, if that's right. So maybe you could explain a little bit about this project and how it might relate to these questions of inclusive language.
Thank you very much, Anne. I actually prepared a few slides. If that is okay, I could share them. Just so perhaps we should choose a bit better. But basically, Archives Portal Europe, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's you should see the slide. It's a consortium of 30-something countries. I think it's 34 at the moment, mostly national archives, but we have all type of archives really in the network, who gather together and put online their archival descriptions. So you can find the digital object if it's available, or just the archival description, and then find where to find it in an archive. And that obviously it's a type of research then that is just based mostly on keywords, because you don't start with a records creator like, oh, there are these archives produced by these people, they are here, let's go see them. You start by the type of topic, the type of person or whatever you're looking for, and then you see, oh, let's see where documents related to this are. So just this is an example of very, very basic Napoleon, since it's about European history type of research. You get all kind of you get all kind of filters. It is highly multilingual. I think we have documents in more than 25 languages. So we try to adjust for spelling with Boolean operators and wildcards and things like that. But mostly it's a type of research, as I said, that it's very much based on keywords, hence on topics. And we have a curated collection of topics that are tagged by the archives when they ingest their material. They also assign topics according to a list that is created by Archives Portal Europe, but it's basically based on the UNESCO and UKAT thesauri. So the labels try to be very much standard. Obviously, this creates enormous problems about language and in many ways. But for now, actually, the archives that have mostly used this topic tagging tool are archives from France and Germany, because there is more of a tradition of topic tagging for archives than there is elsewhere, or other reasons, including obviously the resources to actually topic tag documents, archival descriptions once they are digitized. So we created this automatic topic detection tool, which hopefully will take from keywords, assign a specific topic, and it's online now in its beta version, and it's a very simple keyword query that we can do. We support several languages, including non-Latin based characters, and we have the objective. The reason why this was the spirit with which this was done was to help finding the material relevant to a topic and tag it, but also go beyond the single keyword search to provide broader results. So if I search for Napoleon, I will also get documents that don't have necessarily Napoleon in the archival description, but they will still be related to the French Revolution, to France in those years, to Europe in those years, etc., etc. Now, as we wrote in the paper we published to explain exactly what was done, It's the problem is that it's trained on when you employ embeddings pre-trained on a collection, in case it's Wikipedia, it will also embed the social, gender, and ethnic biases that exist in society. So while this tool is not necessarily about colonial archives, it's not necessarily about minority or content that could potentially refer to diverse ethnicity or colonialism or racism. It's topic neutral. It still lends itself to potentially embarrassing moments for us. And we actually try for this workshop, we try to give a few examples of it, and there are quite a few. So ideally, I guess, if we want to have perhaps launch the discussion here, and this is really a question that I have for everyone in this room, is perhaps try and think of ways where we could train this tool to also recognize these biases and understand them and filter them in a way. And just to give very few quick examples that I found, if I search, I chose Italian because I am Italian, as you can hear from the accent, and I just felt more confident in using the slur that we use in Italy. So Eskimo, which is impolite now, if not definitely a racialized way of referring to Inuits, but it's still very used in Italy to refer to the population. So Eskimo in Italia, oh sorry, just as you can see, it chooses in languages, it does concept and entity. And broad entity mention search, it's really just so you understand what this, it's just a way of expanding further the research. But basically, if I search for the word Eskimo, at least I get material that could be potentially related to the Inuit people, for example. But if I search for Inuit, which is the language we should use, and but it's the language where we should also see reflected in the archival descriptions, as at least the way they're done now, without having to intervene on archival descriptions that may be 200 or 100 years old. We don't really get anything about Inuit, but we do get perhaps one interesting result. It's about the capability of a European race to adapt to other climates. If I search for Sami, again, I get various documents that are about our population, including Finland. But if I search for Lapone, which is again a slur that should not be used by now, but it's still very used in Italia, it doesn't really have absolutely anything on the Sami people, and it only has documents on Finland. And finally, just to give to finish with the examples, macaroni was a racial slur, a bad word to describe Italian immigrants in France. So if I search for macaroni in French, I get a list of things that are from the National Film Center in France, and I get highlighted mostly Pinocchio and Geppetto, which has obviously some of the children literature more famous from Italy, which may not necessarily be nice to have a racial slur attached to a piece of literature. And these are, sorry, I'll just stop presenting now, but I'm really done. But I just think these are, just a few examples found by randomly making a quick search. There are bound to be many, many others. So it's something that we would like to tackle with Archives Portal Europe, because while we can put an asterisk or understand the context when you do archival research, traditionally, when you have these automatized words, it can be potentially problematic.
Thanks very, very much, Marcia. So in fact, really, rather than an automated system being a kind of a fix for the automated systems can institutionalize and embed via, the reliance on word embeddings that have brought in a whole set of semantic, a whole set of semantic relationships between racist ideas or offensive and discriminatory ideas, and kind of embed them into the black box of the system. And there's space, needs to be as much space as possible for human interpretation and human judgment, I guess, in this. And so it would be very interesting to hear later, perhaps, if there are, in terms of people in the audience, if there are suggestions or ideas from other institutions where automated methods have been used to attempt to deal with this. I just want to move back again quickly, though, to come back to Stephen for a minute, and to go back to the question of the kind of basic principles of developing inclusive terminology, because the project that you mentioned with the internship with Carissa Chu, you actually developed a sort of set of principles which underpinned what you were doing. I wondered if you could maybe share a bit about what those were, and why it was that you kind of, as an institution, felt you needed to do that. You did mention before about the importance of getting people on board and achieving a consensus around principles on which to base these, which are a series of new practices in the institution. And so it would be great to hear a bit more about that, actually.
Yes, and so the high-level principles, I should stress that they weren't entirely original. The work that Carissa was doing was looking across the board and going to various institutions to see what they'd been doing. And so with those, she was able to find other examples, I think principally in the United States, but also in Australia and other places. She then had a look at all of those and then condensed them to come up with the high-level principles that we've been looking at. Really, it's just a statement to be able to say these are what we are trying to aim to achieve, and it's kind of like a standard that we want to get to, and also we can be judged against so that people can have a look at that. They're not, I think they're a very clear set of statements, and they just really describe what I think any institution should be trying to achieve in terms of its descriptive practices. If I give you an example of them, for example, we commit to the use of non-discriminatory language to meet modern descriptive standards relating to protected characteristics and other non-protected characteristics, including but not limited to class, nationality, and immigration status. It was an attempt just to give clear statements to say which we could sort of be judged against. And as a sequence, they also tied in with the work we were trying to do on policy development. So the high-level principles were introductory to that. We'd then have a second phase, which was the actual processes of achieving that, which would look very particularly at descriptive practices in the areas I mentioned earlier, not just archives and manuscripts, but also printed book collections, including serials, moving image, the sound archives, giving all of those areas the same approach, and then also tying that in with governance so that we're underpinned to say that, yes, we have a structure in place which is trying to give us an in-the-round picture of how we want to deliver this, and how we can be looked at as an institution trying to deliver that. So I think there were a set of principles, and if we can sort of deliver to that standard, we should be moving forward in the right direction.
Just a quick follow-up question, because you mentioned obviously you built on the work from other institutions, but did you have to do a lot to localize the work? I mean, had to make it specific to Scotland and specific to your institution?
Not a lot. I think the principal thing was some minor tweaking to the principles, but it's more the way that we looked at grouping them to try to get them into a package which made it slightly clearer than the ones we'd seen previously. But in terms of the aims, I think, as I mentioned, their principles, I think, would apply to any archival institution or other library trying to do the same things.
Thanks. And just to go back to you, Marta, for a minute, in terms of a sort of principles-based approach, is that something that might feed into do you think might be able to feed into the design of automated systems in the future, or is that a difficult thing to do in terms of the it represents a kind of opposite direction to the general approach with machine learning driven systems, which work from the existing data and build upwards in terms of patterns rather than trying to impose principles on them from above, if you see what I mean.
Sure. Well, I think the technical part of his answer, I suspect it would be quite difficult, perhaps. But I'm really not familiar with actually the technicalities of it, to be honest. From a political perspective, as an answer, I think probably rather than go with principles, which are extremely difficult for a machine to understand, we could go with training on ontologies and vocabularies that are thought precisely to map out these racial slurs in this case, but whatever type of offensive or problematic, or really just a historical language that we're facing. So creating, I think, a map with these vocabularies. I think one of the document that was going around in the anti-colonial working group of this unicorn project about LGBT plus ontologies. So I think something like that could be potentially something that the machine can easily understand, without trying to make it become sentient in a way.
So in other words, actually the work on the developing inclusive glossaries is not only for potentially of value in terms of training humans, but also in terms of feeding into refining the training of machine learning systems, because they have already been trained on existing data sets and based on ontologies and knowledge systems that have been shaped by racism and colonialism, and there actually needs to be an active intervention. I guess that's what you're saying with designing new vocabularies that would make that would recontextualize these words, I think. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, yeah, that's exactly what I mean. I mean, it's very easy to tell to a person, a child, and try to educate ourselves, like, don't use macaroni, that's an offensive term, but it's much more difficult to make a machine understand it. Just, no.
Yes. So I just want to turn back finally before we wrap up this part of the discussion and open up for questions and discussion from the floor. I've turned back to Dorothy. And I wonder, Dorothy, do you have ideas about what cultural heritage institutions in former colonizing countries could do to ensure that they're working collaboratively with educators, researchers, and the publics in former colonized countries to develop inclusive terminology? Is it also about kind of pedagogical practices and mutual spaces for learning from each other, as much as it is about trying to develop vocabularies and glossaries and language tools?
Yeah. Sure. I do think that institutions could consider holding workshops to help raise awareness and represent the views of the former colonized countries. I think it would be important to listen to the marginalized voices, for example, in the colonized countries, and this would be a step towards inclusive terminology. Also, I do think that it would be important for collaborative description and interpretation of the collections to come up with inclusive terminology. I do think that it would be important to provide a kind of meaningful descriptions of the colonial collections, where at the same time situating the collections in the appropriate historical context. So those are very key steps that I think should be taken, and also encouraging archival users in former colonial countries to share their knowledge and contextualization. You do remember that in the workshop, we try to encourage students to add missing information to the collection. So I think it's quite important to encourage users to add missing information to the collection. So that is one of the other steps towards inclusive terminology. I also think that it's important to work closely with educators, researchers, and the public in the former colonized countries to develop inclusive terminologies. I think this is very, very important in as far as representing the voices of the communities and then the different audiences with the images. So I must say it's important to address the aspect of absence and bias, and also inclusive terminology is really timely, given that we're looking at a key step towards decolonizing collections. So I think this is very, very timely. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. And I think I'd like to kind of open up now and see if there are questions or contributions from the audience.